Juliette Murphy, the CEO and co-founder of Floodmapp. It's a huge privilege to have you on Geospatial FM.
Thanks so much for having me, Wilfred. Great to be here.
I'm also really happy to have another Aussie come on. We've had a couple recently. The last one, I think, was Alex Logan from Cecil.Earth, a nature data platform. So it's good to keep up the representation.
Cecil's great.
Oh, okay. You're all connected. There we go. That's a sign in the podcast. I've reached that stage where everybody knows about everyone. Cool. So we've got a fairly simple agenda, but I think it will still be impactful. Clearly, we have the latest round of water-related NatCat events upon us in the Northern Hemisphere, really. And, obviously what's all over the news lately about what's been happening in Texas to do with flooding. So I'm doing my best to keep up with events on the podcast, just like happened at the beginning of the year with the LA fires. So now switching over to geospatial and other related systems, teams and people like yourself who are responding to these floods. So the first item to kick things off is for you, Juliette, to step us through operational impact-based flood forecasting, and for you to talk around that in the context of disaster response happening right now in Texas.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Wilfred. So at Floodmapp, we specialize in, you said it, operational impact-based flood forecasting. So we're really passionate about public safety. Our whole mission at Floodmapp is about saving lives. If people know that their house or their loved ones themselves are at risk and have enough time, they're going to be able to act and move to higher ground or evacuate to a safe location. And that's what we're all about. That in practice can be a little harder to do. It's not so simple. And I mean, there's lots about what is happening in Texas right now that I think is evidence of that we have, a lot of work we need to do in this space. And so Floodmapp is really dedicated to filling a critical gap in being able to not just forecast how much rain is going to fall or how high the rivers are going to get, but go that final step and predict what is the expected inundation extent, the depth, and the impact of the flooding. So I've got some slides. It might be helpful. Happy to share them if that helps visualize a little bit about what we do. So a really big challenge faced by, the public and emergency managers and government agencies. Firstly, I'll say that emergency managers and many of the emergency managers working on the ground in Texas right now, these are just the most incredible humans you've ever met, working with often little data to be doing everything they can to keep the public safe. And there's some great broad, forecast products available, things like NOAA with the flash flood outlook, things like the river forecasting centers that might provide a predicted peak that the river will peak at. But if you're not a hydrology expert or hydraulic modeler, you might not know what 30 feet means. It might be hard to translate that into, which people, property, and critical infrastructure are going to be impacted. And so often what we find is there's this gap between some of the more scalable forecast products or point-based river forecasts and what actions actually need to be taken and which communities and people are most at risk. And that's the gap that we're really closing at Floodmapp. So we specialize in taking those, meteorology forecasts and doing a lot of modeling to understand how high the rivers are going to get and where the flood waters will go, or, what will be the inundation extent. So we run this as a live hazard layer that we can then intersect with structures or buildings and commercial, whatever structure or road layer we want to understand what will be impacted, to really help emergency managers have more actionable insights to make quicker decisions and evacuate communities, close roads in advance, or really prepare. So maybe
Could I
this
just
slide,
ask a
please.
question here, Juliette? So just to show that I'm doing my best to keep up with the space here and different companies that are trying to respond. So last week we had an episode with Shelley Close, who started True Flood Risk. And a key sort of output from their work is this idea of the first floor elevation. Apparently that is not necessarily known accurately for all buildings. Is that a factor in the work that you do?
Yeah, I love the work that Shelley's doing, and that's a critical piece. So, I mean, here where I'm from in Queensland, we have a lot of what's called the Queenslander. They're built on, stilts. They're kind of high up, often like out of the floodwaters, and the first story might be, 3 maybe higher meters or so. So
Shelley
having
actually
that,
mentioned that in her
yeah,
episode, yeah.
first floor elevation gives you an accurate view of not just this property is impacted, but likely, the living room is impacted, which is good. It's interesting, particularly for insurers who are wanting to get, accurate data on damage assessments and such. But certainly when you're talking about a public safety context, you might want to evacuate a street, even if you know that they might be kind of, safe on their floors. If they can't get out to get groceries and they're surrounded by floodwaters, up to the first floor, you still likely want to evacuate that area. So first floor elevation is used, I think, in different times for different contexts, but certainly it's really, really valuable to intersect with, forecasting products like Floodmapp if you wanted to get that really granular view and understanding of what's going on.
Cool. My job as a reporter is done to make the connection.
Love it. So yeah, so what this graphic is showing is what Floodmapp Dash is doing. So Dash is our proprietary rapid flood hydrology and hydraulics modeling technology. It stands for Dynamic Automated Scalable Hydroinformatics. And what this technology is doing is taking in a range of data sets, the rainfall data, number one. This is observed rainfall data, things like the multi-radar, multi-sensor quantitative precipitation estimate, and short-term and longer-term forecasts, such as the high-resolution rapid refresh or ECMWF, or what other, global forecast model you might want to use. And then taking into the model all the sensors as well. So things like the USGS river gauge sensors from, NOAA, NWS, and also the terrain. So what's the, digital elevation model or the surface of the land that we're modeling. And so we'll take all those things in to understand how much rainfall has fallen and is going to fall in the catchment, how much we expect of that to seep into the ground based on how saturated the catchments are, and then predict how high the river will get at each of these stations. And then that will plug into the hydraulic model, which is then understanding how we expect that water to behave over land, where we expect it to go, and produce an output, which is an inundation extent and depth. And this is all happening every single hour, 24/7, 365 days a year. So it's continuous and operational, such that every single hour when new gauges read data, so as the rain falls, as river levels rise, it will update, and the forecast might then output, this is what we expect to see in 24 hours time, but it will move and be dynamic. And then this can be intersected with what we call our impact analytics service to be outputting, these structures are at risk, these houses or these roads. So there's a lot of flexibility in how this is delivered. Ultimately, it's not a product that we have with the front end. We deliver this as an API, a flexible integration into any geospatial system that the emergency managers might be using within the EOC. Typically, that's Esri a lot of the time, but we've integrated with Waze, Mapbox, Leaflet, doesn't really matter. So yeah, it's really exciting. It's successfully saved lives and prevented, millions in losses. We've seen big success with this in the state of Queensland, as well as city of Boston, city of Norfolk. And we're now sort of seeing it being used in the recovery and response in the Texas floods too.
Okay, this is amazing, and I have to say I've been a bit mesmerized watching that animation. But yeah, really effective. I've loved these two visuals. Yeah, animations are helpful. Okay, so the first thing that springs to mind there is the contrast between what you've been talking about and what you've been showing on screen and the FEMA flood map data viewer. There's something where there's a couple of options. There's the left button allows you to go in and put in your address, and it will quickly bring up like a web viewer showing, a few map layers of, in one of them is the 100-year flood zone around the location that you've put in. There's another button you can click on, and it takes you to sort of a nation scale map. It's not entirely apparent immediately what's shown on it. You have to sort of pan and zoom around, and eventually once you get down to a location, you see basically the same data. If you click on one of the polygons, a pop-up comes up, is a hyperlink. There's two hyperlinks in there. The first one you can use to download a static map. Some of them look quite ancient, some of them look quite new, but it's, I guess, the formal assessment from the government of what the latest flood model that the taxpayers have paid for, that shows, I guess from a regulatory perspective, a legal perspective, something that insurers have to price against what the risk is for flood against that address. So I've used words like clunky. I've talked, hopefully not too disparagingly, but honestly, about the process to get to insight there. There's a big contrast, it seems, with these nice animations that a company like yours is able to offer. So how does the gap or the gulf between these kind of products and yours sort of sit? What's the discussion in the industry?
Yeah, I really appreciate you kind of stepping us through that, and the ways in which someone like yourself or anyone from the public can kind of access and understand their risk. And I think those FEMA flood maps are intended for that purpose. These are regulatory maps that define the floodplain, the special flood hazard areas, the flood insurance rate maps that are going to govern where, development guidelines and, flood insurance rates. So they can be really helpful for understanding whether someone is within a high risk flood area. But there's a couple of things I'd say about this. Firstly, they're not the be all and end all capture showing who is at risk. So these are just, let's say like a 1% scenario, a 0.2% scenario, or equivalent of like, 1 in 100 and 1 in 500 frequencies. They're not the only place that it can flood. So they give maybe a view of the coastal, the riverine risk, but they're not going to show you all the areas where you may experience flash flooding, driven from particularly high intensity precipitation events. And certainly, we have to understand that risk is a continuum. It's all about frequency and likelihood. And I think that's really an important thing for us to understand with flooding, that just because you're, just outside of the 0.2%, it doesn't mean that you're never going to
You will never
flood.
be impacted.
If it rains, it can flood. And I think that's a really great way to understand it. But I love what you're doing with being able to communicate how to understand risk. And I think that's such a critical thing. Once we have an understanding of risk, that can help us understand how to mitigate the risk. But if we don't understand that we're at risk, then we're not likely to act and be, investing in mitigation of risk. So I really want to do more to help the public understand risk. And I'm certainly very passionate about operationalizing risk management. And so to answer your question, where Floodmapp is very different from, say, the FEMA flood maps or other risk maps, we understand that there's so many great products and firms that are helping to build this view of risk. We're wanting to collaborate with that and help reduce the risk. So if we wanted to solve the problem, overnight, like we really couldn't. We can't just move all those structures outside of the floodplain tomorrow. This is a really big challenge. And I think part of it is about understanding how to live safely within the floodplain. And that's where flood forecasting comes in. So if there are structures, communities that are living within high risk sections of the floodplain, I think it's imperative to have a really good end-to-end best practice flood warning system to alert people living within these, areas that they're at risk, and giving everyone the opportunity to have information that can save their life, that can help them get to higher ground ahead of the flood, or evacuate safely to a family member's house and help them avoid, driving in areas where there's flooding. So Floodmapp, we really specialize in that operational impact-based flood forecasting. So understanding, that every flood is different. Just because you sort of have this map, that's not necessarily the flooding that we're going to see tomorrow. So it's a little bit like distinguishing the climate versus the weather. Like you might know statistically. Yeah.
There's a lot to me, the key differentiator is that you have a live feed. You've got data streams coming in from sensor networks, gauges. As I understand it, you probably got would there be Earth observation satellite data and weather satellite? So your system incorporates near real time, basically, data. Whereas the FEMA flood models, in my discussions with other people yesterday, somebody pointed out that a lot of these maps might be based on climate and weather models that were current in the year 2000.
Yeah, exactly. You hit the nail on the head. And now you've just reminded me of
Is it Atlas 14? Is that the correct term?
That's the basis. For the historic and I guess statistical rainfall data sets. Yes.
Yeah, and another thing to add here is that there's almost a runaway exponential effect in play at the moment with climate change. So the distance between present circumstances and a model as the basis for a flood map from literally 25 years ago, each year that gulf between reality and what was modeled is getting larger.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right. So, there's a lot of changing factors. Like we're seeing more extreme events. We're seeing floods that are driven by, cloudbursts or, atmospheric rivers that are bringing heavier, high intensity precipitation events than necessarily the magnitude that we've seen in the past. And, sometimes this might be coinciding with, sea levels that are higher, or, storm surge that are higher. So when you get a hurricane that might be bringing storm surge as well as high intensity precipitation on top of that, we're seeing scenarios that might exceed the historic, intensity frequency, estimates that were in place when those models were formed.
Okay, all right. So you mentioned in your characterization of operational impact-based flood forecasting that the interventions that have been able to be made by your customers of Floodmapp have saved lives. So have you got any examples perhaps from the state of Queensland and Australia?
I'll share an example. Actually, this is not a bad view of what we were talking about before that you mentioned, Wilfred, that it's operational. So this is a live data pipeline that's running operationally, 24/7, 365 days a year. As we get new rainfall and river heights in, this will run. And so we're seeing this as an example. This is a forecast model simulation for Hurricane Helene, which is showing at the top of the screen that hydrology forecast component that we talked about. So that blue line that you're seeing is updating every hour, outputting, this is like a 6-hour forecast view that's updating every single hour of what the predicted water level is going to do. And that at the bottom of the screen, you're seeing this hydraulic model. So it's taking in that hydraulic forecast of the flood height and then simulating that to project what we expect the inundation extent and depth and which buildings that we anticipate are going to be impacted. And so this is really in, a visual view, what we call operational impact-based flood forecasting. And so, let me take you through an example of how this has been used in Queensland. We've worked with agencies like the Queensland Fire and Emergency Services and Queensland Police in Australia, who's been using this technology since 2021, where in Beaudesert, a traditional sort of forecast from the federal agencies might have told them that the river was going to peak at 12 meters, but they were able to leverage Floodmapp to understand, okay, well, here's where we think the floodwaters will go and which, parts of the community are going to be impacted 24 hours before the flood happened. So it really gave them more time and certainty and actionable insights to go and begin, door knocking in plenty of time before the flood to keep that community safe.
Are you able to sort of say to customers, with the system, we can give that team that needs to do the door knocking 5 hours to get their act together?
So the lead time always depends and is a function of the catchment size. So you may get smaller catchments where you're talking a matter of hours, because once the rain falls, that flooding responds so quickly. That's, flash flooding, so less than 6 hours warning time. However, so this is true of a lot of coastal kind of catchments. Inland, inner Queensland, in systems like, the Condamine Ballon, some of these bigger systems, you might get at least a week, maybe more of warning time, because the water's moving so much slower. So it really depends. But as a general rule, we have a product that scales across the state of Queensland that is operationally giving, a 24-hour look ahead time of the peak maximum predicted extent expected in that catchment where we have coverage in engaged areas.
Okay, I love this
So
for
this
the
is
education and this important term that you've introduced of catchments and the impact on these lead times. So yeah, thanks.
No worries. Yeah, absolutely. So this is this is a nice visual of the system in action during Tropical Cyclone Alfred. So with the federal system, you have these warnings that are sort of catchment scale, and this is a catchment here that you're seeing in the different colors. So this is a drainage area of where if rain was to fall on those different color-coded areas, it would all drain within that particular river system. And so these were classified as major, moderate, or minor flood warnings from the Bureau of Meteorology, and released that these catchments are at risk. And we were adding context for emergency managers, really able to bring some of those warnings down to what it means on a community level scale. So this is for an area called Laidley in southeast Queensland, showing the the nowcast kind of in action, and giving you an idea of the forecasted buildings that would be impacted, which really, for emergency managers that are looking to work with the local disaster management groups or support local emergency management, this kind of information of like which roads, which particular homes, it's really crucial to connecting for that last mile in messaging, whether that be, through text messaging via an emergency alert system, or simply through door knocking to get people out of harm's way. So it allows them to really focus and prioritize their resources.
It's incredible. I mean, I don't know if you can run that animation again. Here it goes, but it's going to go across a field. And I just saw this. There we go. So you can see the model even predicting the spill of the water. I don't know how accurate it is, but it seems to be responding to minor changes in elevation across that brown field at the bottom center of the image, which is just fascinating.
Yeah, that's right. So it really, this is in big flood events like this, the governing factor often becomes the terrain. So where the slopes and where the low points are, or depression, that you're going to see more storage versus sort of like, distinct kind of channels that are going to be higher velocity.
Yeah. Okay, I have to bring also mention another podcast guest. We had Gavin Lewis last year. He's, I think, the chief scientific officer at Fathom, which happens to have been bought by Swiss Re as well. So yeah, there's a nice link there also, or a contrast for listeners in showing another flood modeling effort here to accompany that from Fathom discussed before.
Amazing. Yeah, they're doing some brilliant work at Fathom in like scalable flood risk mapping.
Okay, so this is another one, is it?
Yeah, so this is just a validation, sort of showing we put a lot of energy. We have a flood operations team that's dedicated to, calibration and validation of the models, and, benchmarking post-event, how accurate were we, making improvements such that the model gets better over time. And what you're seeing here is an aerial image showing, captured at the peak of the flooding on the left, and then showing on the right how that compared to the Floodmapp model. So it turns out it was really highly accurate for that particular region.
Okay, so this is the blue square around that, what looks like a shed.
Yeah, exactly. So it looks like there's a shed in the blue square and then another sort of shed or structure here in the green square that you can see it sort of was on a little mound and has a bit of green grass that wasn't impacted by the flooding, which is actually captured spot on in our model there.
Wow, okay, yeah, that's really interesting to see. Okay,
Yeah.
good. So you have been foreshadowing another topic in our agenda, which is, I guess, what to do once a community or decision makers representing a community have this, and I like this term, this nowcasting tool to give them a feeling for, a potential inundation event. So naturally, what the mind turns to is some sort of a warning system. So could you talk around the topic of best practice for an end-to-end early warning system?
Yeah, sure. And so I might go back visually to give you sort of one more example of the impact-based flood forecasting and then speak to sort of how that connects to, best practice end-to-end flood warning system. So maybe let me start. Yeah, broadly speaking, there's up to sort of 5 different components that are going to go into a best practice flood warning system. So we want, number 1, a good forecast of the meteorology, like what rainfall are we expecting to fall on a region. Number 2, we're ideally going to want a hydrology model to forecast, how high the river is going to peak. So if we look at this animation, this is this component of Floodmapp that is aimed at predicting, taking into account the rainfall, which you can see at the top of the graph, which is going to be changing every hour. The rainfall forecast is going to be updating. And this model is predicting, okay, how high do we think the rivers are going to peak based on what we know about the hydrology of the catchment. So land cover, soil saturation, what kind of soils, how much is going to seep into the catchment versus runoff, and how much rainfall has that catchment seen, in the 2 weeks prior. So that's sort of number 2. Number 3, then we want to put that into a hydraulics model to run, that forecast river height based on that anticipated rainfall and give a view of, okay, where do we think the inundation extent and depth is going to be, because that's really the missing link in being able to understand the impact. And so this is a view of that impact-based flood forecast in action in the Western Queensland floods in April 2025. When 24 hours ahead of time, the state agency were able to receive through our system a view of where are the floodwaters going to be in 24 hours time, not just like where the rainfall is going to be, but like where is the floodwaters going to be and what is going to be impacted. So this is the next piece, is sort of that impact analytics. So using that model to overlay on some, whether it's structures or roads, to get a view of the who and the where, like how many people are going to be impacted, which homes, which structures. So being able to really narrow it down. And this is the last mile and critical link piece that would then feed into an ultimate like warning system. So be this, an alerting system like Genesis Protect platform, where someone can come in, use sort of a polygon of Floodmapp and overlay it with evacuation zones and click a button and say, I want to give these people in this evacuation zone a notice to, there's a flood coming, move to higher ground now. Or maybe it's going out via, a siren or long range audio device, or, the integrated public warning alert system to give those people some warning.
Could you tell us a bit more about this Genesis? Is it an app? Is it something people have to have installed on their phones? Does battery life play a role here?
So the Genesis is just one early warning system that you could use. I know different counties and communities use different types in the US. Some might use Everbridge or other systems. Some might use Genesis. Some might simply, rely on iPause or something like that. So this is something that allows you to send a message into the wireless emergency alert system like WEA, or similar to like an Amber Alert. So to any mobile device that is within that region through the wireless network or cell towers, that phone would get an alert if it was sent out via that platform.
So I think that's been a useful tour. Is there anything else you have missed in characterizing the benefit that Floodmapp can offer?
Certainly very topical. What's happening right now is the floods in Texas. And so we've been actively working with Texas Division of Emergency Management and FEMA through a project funded by Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology, to where Floodmapp Nowcast and Floodmapp Postcast have been supporting search and rescue and damage assessment operations. So this is a view just to sort of provide another idea of how these live web mapping services have been operationalized within Esri to support, first responders and emergency managers on the ground, to overlay that live mapping feed of the inundation extent over, structures such as this one's looking at the National Structures Inventory and using the FEMA HAZAS methodology to rapidly estimate, structures impacted and damage estimates and where have been the hardest hit counties to get support and target and prioritize efforts to the hardest hit areas. So I think why this is important and why I'm bringing this up is it speaks to the work that we really want to do, working with these counties moving forward, the state moving forward, and how this technology can be adapted. And I think there's a couple of things that are key to note here. Number one, it's giving a really accurate view of the flooding that's occurred. So we've been validating this based on crowdsourced imagery we're seeing on the ground, damage assessment data sets and satellite data sets and the like. So what we're finding is it's really accurate compared to the other models that have been used, other satellite or synthetic aperture radar derived data sets. And so what we can imagine is, what if something like this could be in place before a flood happens to predict the impact to these structures and linked into a system like Genesis Protect platform or long range audio devices. I think this is a view of a best practice flood warning system that could be in place to support counties and states in being able to get early warnings out before a flood happens. And that's really what I'm so passionate about when it comes to saving lives. I think technology like this has just such a critical role to play in helping people get out safely.
I'm feeling a degree of urgency, honestly, hearing you put this in front of us, Juliette. Maybe these things are easy to get dramatic and melodramatic about, but I don't know, genuinely, there is urgency. I think all of us are feeling the significance of what you're saying here. Just about that dashboard that you showed, and you were saying how accurate it was, that the ground truthing was often near enough to the same as what was predicted. Did you compare it to the FEMA flood modeling? How did it compare?
Yeah, we did. And so with this event, there were regions that were impacted, which were not in the FEMA floodplains. So I think that speaks to
Right.
and highlights what we talked about earlier, that the FEMA floodplains won't show you everywhere that's at risk of flooding. They might show the riverine sections that are most at risk, but might not identify areas or properties that are at risk from high intensity precipitation, flash flooding. And so I think certainly our postcast has showed that there are areas outside the FEMA floodplain that were impacted by this event. And I think that speaks to the need for counties and the public to really be aware of this risk, that it doesn't necessarily mean that if you're not in a FEMA floodplain that you're not at risk.
Yeah. I love this for highlighting the risk of false negatives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel so heartbroken by the loss of life that's occurred. Certainly my thoughts are with everyone in Texas right now, and not just the families that have been torn apart by this event, but a lot of the first responders and emergency managers who've been working this event. Like, things like this take just such a big toll on the communities impacted. And I love that you run this postcast and podcast postcast to talk about the technologies that are out there, because I think there's so much we can all do together to work to put systems in place to help improve public safety going forward.
Yeah, yeah, okay. All right, so I think this is a good point to introduce of all things, a LinkedIn post quoting. I mean, it's time for our discipline to get to work. This type of analysis can be done at nation scale immediately, and Overture maps foundations building footprints used to detect which people are next in the firing line. An LLM connected to the pipeline could then automatically write political and media campaign material and strategies to pressure funding out of governments. And that's in response to this post on Reddit, which basically is, as you can see in the headline, it's as simple as that. It's the simple map of Camp Mystic and the fact that they have chosen or had chosen to put the camp facility in a riverbed. So how do you, Juliette, as the co-founder and CEO of Floodmapp, respond to this comment that I've made?
Yeah, it's just really closely with what I would love to see, Wilfred, that there are so many, counties in the US, so many cities where this I think the tragedy that happened in Camp Mystic is just truly heartbreaking, to be honest. I've really grappled with it. These events, they hit me hard after living through flood events firsthand and seeing family impacted. So it's devastating, and I think we need to learn from it, because I think the other thing that's scary is there are so many other Camp Mystics in other counties that have structures at risk today
That's what I was trying to get
that
at.
are risk of this happening again. And so now is our time to really, as a community, as floodplain managers, as emergency managers, as flood forecasting and risk professionals, as geospatial experts, we need to work together as a community to really advocate for funding for critical life-saving emergency warning systems, because they're going to save lives. And that post you shared, that certainly aligns with our dashboard, which is showing this is the postcast, which is a really accurate view that TDEM and FEMA are using of the damage which has happened. So this is our postcast live impact dashboard. And if we zoom in here, looking at Camp Mystic, that aligns really closely with the extent of where we're showing the floodwaters went through this event and flowed through that camp. It's absolutely heartbreaking. A lot of these structures were destroyed, and
Okay, so the
like you're
point
saying,
you
they
said
were
there are other, yeah, so I guess we're in alignment here, and all of us are really. The first thing that you think of, I mean, I've got a 4-year-old daughter. I'm a relatively new parent, I don't know if this is the same for all parents, but sometimes I just have this panic, that things that I see happening to other kids might happen to my kid. It's just, and sometimes my mind just, replays this, simulates what, it's what I'm trying to say is it's palpable, the feeling and the response that you have. And naturally, the first thing is to ask, where in the US are the other Camp Mystics? Simple as that. So that analysis, I'm glad you agree, needs to happen. It is within the capability of our discipline to do. It's probably in terms of data collection, setting up the processing pipeline, the infrastructure, the whole cloud computing approach. We're talking around about a week of effort. I've already begun with some colleagues. I'm actually, funnily enough, meeting with a venture capitalist in Atlanta tomorrow to, put this idea before him. So this will happen either with funding or without, and it needs to happen, because this is just, the human thing to do is that this loss of life shouldn't go without, some significant effort and response. So this will happen one way or another, and we will have this data set of all of these building footprints that are at least within the 100-year FEMA flood polygon. And one of the many reasons why this has been a really useful conversation is that you've said that there's a significant number of false negatives that may result in.
Yeah. I'm so excited by this work, and I love that you're doing this work. I'm not a parent myself, but I have some nieces near and dear to me so much, and so I think of them, that if they were at a camp and something like this were to happen, it is so horrific, and we need to work as an industry to understand, do everything in our power to prevent this kind of tragedy happening going forward. And I think the thing that I've been thinking so much the last couple of weeks is about smoke alarms and the amount that is invested in fire prevention and safety. So if we take the United States, approximately 145 million homes, let's assume $20 a smoke alarm, and based on regulatory, by law, one smoke alarm in every room, outside the room, and one on every level. So we'll assume 3 per household, let's say. That's $8.7 billion has been spent just on smoke alarms for fires. And this doesn't even include the spend on, public buildings like schools, aged care facilities, camps, or the county and city fire department spend, fire trucks, that would all be on top of it. But what is the expenditure that we've invested in flood early warning systems? And, when we look at definitely the economic damages of fire and flood, it actually suggests that flood, by direct flood and also hurricane, is really far and above the cost and damages of fire. So I'd really like to see that expenditure on flood early warning systems reflect the risk, because I think it should be proportional to the risk and exposure. If we're investing this much on fire, then we really need an alert system in every community where people are at risk.
My goodness. Okay. So again, this has been such a useful episode, Juliette. You've raised, what can I say? It's been a rich and full characterization of the good and the bad, really, and how humanity is presently addressing this particular risk. And I love this contrast. It's actually a way to really connect the two categories of NatCat events that have now come up on the podcast starting at the beginning of the year with this fire-related one. That you've been making a contrast with. This has been an amazing survey of how, in a real-time operations sense, a company like Floodmapp can help in disaster response. But help me here. Is there a way to categorize these different flood modeling efforts? We've had true flood risk. We've mentioned Fathom. We've mentioned FEMA. Another one that I'm aware of is First Street. But then there's Floodmapp. Do these different outfits fall into different buckets?
Yeah, sure. So I think folks like Fathom and First Street are really specialist players in large-scale risk modeling. So helping the public understand, or government agencies or enterprises understand what infrastructure, what structures are at risk, and how much risk are they exposed to. And I think Floodmapp is really focused on the niche of helping operationalize that risk management. So helping emergency managers understand, okay, we understand these communities are at risk. Who should we evacuate in 24 hours? And that's the niche where we're really trying to support them in solving that problem of how do we get people out safely? Who do we alert? How do we route traffic around flooded roads in real time? And, where should we put the swift water rescue crews? Where do we need helicopters to pull people off roofs? And, search and rescue operations, post-disaster rapid damage assessment, all of those sort of emergency response. That's the niche that we play in. And so in that way, I think, flood risk management is a whole, team of, we have so many companies
There's
working
an
in the space
ecosystem.
to do exactly brilliant work to understand the risk, manage the risk, respond to that emergency, so that disaster management part of the life cycle. And that's a bit how I would describe we all fit in. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's been, a really useful overview. You are keeping the wave of understanding going for us all in this episode, Juliette. So thanks very much. And if I could also speak to the humanity of this as well, I really appreciated that you were able to talk about data processing pipelines and show us some animations of flood models, but also speak to the emotional and the human impact. So I feel that this has been the well-rounded episode that I was hoping it to be.
Well, thank you so much, Wilfred. It's certainly been a real pleasure to talk to you and connect on the impact of this event, I think, on many of us. And as tragic as it is, I'm just happy to see it sort of bring the community together for us all to work to improve safety going forward.